Great. Well, thanks, Mike and Peter. That was a really interesting talk and discussion. And so now I'd like to invite the three speakers to turn on their video and microphones when appropriate. And we can have a general discussion. Hopefully people are not fading and too tired. I know some of you are in a late time zone. In fact, I think all three of our speakers actually are in a late time zone now. But hopefully you have still a few brain cells that are working. So please, people can type your questions into the chat. They can be for a specific speaker, or they can be a general question for all three. And in some ways, that would kind of be the most interesting, I think, to see how the three of you might answer the same question. So on that, I might just start with a question. And it sort of came up a little bit in the discussion that we just had. But my question basically is how to scale up from almost all the research on interactions is on two people, on dyads. And so there's a real question of how to scale this up. And I think it's particularly important for music because when you look across cultures, people sing together. I mean, that's probably the more frequent than just singing in a pair. And so, you know, if you have a model of yourself and a model of another, and, you know, you're making these adaptations and so on according to your predictions of what's going to happen next and so on, how do you scale that up if you have 30 people that you're interacting with? And Keith, you probably still have to go from one person to the group in your complex computational models. So maybe for you is how do you scale up to two people? Even how do you incorporate that? And then beyond that, you know, what sort of mechanism, do we need new mechanisms, or do the ones we have, will they scale up to these larger ensembles?
Who wants to go first? Do you want to go first, Keith? Do you have something to say already? Or
well, I guess, you know, I think even going for me going from 1 to 2 is okay, right? Because you can put two models and have them listen to each other, and like as long as there's just one other input, you're fine. The problem becomes when you have like 3 and you have you know, 2 different inputs that you have to synchronize to, and the question is, how do you just take the average, or like what's the right way to incorporate that information, which I think adds a lot more complexity. So I feel like I'm in the same boat with you guys. And I guess I would start by, you know, like if I go back to the drumming example that I started with, you know, 2008 drummers that are all synchronized together. Probably the guy in the center is not listening to every drummer equally, right? He's listening more to the people that are next to him, right? And then that allows you to sort of have some kind of spatial filter at least. So it's still not a problem. You still have a problem of you know, dealing with multiple inputs, but at least it's not as complicated as dealing with all 30, right? Like, or all 2008, right? There's some amount of, you know, you listen to the person next to you who's also listening to the person next to him, and that allows for some of this to simplify a bit. But I think maybe you guys will have better answers about how to go from, you know, the 2 to 3, 2 to multiple.
No, I think what you just said, Keith, is the key. My thinking of it was that we can look at the non-human synchronous chorusing, the things that are going on there, where the effects are shown to be strongest from neighboring individuals, just as you said, and it's very straightforward to model. The question is, with the in the sort of models that I've been working with the higher the higher order things, the prediction. But again, I think it's a matter of just adding a weight that's linked to proximity. That's one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is to build in, can be in addition to some sort of weighting of the information, but also a temporal integration window. And events that occur within a particular window are perceived as a single event, and that is the reference. That's another relevant strategy. But the final thing that I'll add that I think is a very interesting one, and it again speaks to the example that Keith had, and I'm not sure how they did it in that particular case, but there's the the German equivalent is the Posaunentag, when all the brass instrumentalists converge on a different city every year. And I can't remember if it was 6,000 of them came to Leipzig there, and I could hear it from my office, which was, quite a way away. And there, when I went to investigate, of course, they have conductors peppered throughout it and screens. So there are these local hubs of coordination that are helping to do it. And of course, in an orchestra, there's the conductor. And I'll just mention quickly one study that I like. And I'm not really sure what if this has been followed up as much as it could be. This observation by Rudolf Rasch, reported in a book chapter in '88, where he was interested in a number of things, including at what point does it become beneficial for a group of musicians in terms of the group size to have a conductor? And the modeling he did, by looking at whether the variability of the asynchronization error, as he called it, was larger if people are using themselves as references versus using a common single reference. The number was 9. And he then followed it up by going and looking at concert programs of ensemble concerts where the members of the ensemble are listed, and you can see whether there was a conductor listed, and it turned out to be similar. I replicated that in an ensemble in Australia in a book chapter with Clemens Vollner. We report this. So there seems to be something in that where the way people are coordinating and the references that they use for coordination does seem to change with group size. So this would have to be taken into account in the model as well, where at some point you need you have another agent coming in who's the referent for all the other models that are running in parallel. So it's not a simple answer, but I think those are some of the ideas that I'd have.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Stephanie, I don't know if you had something to add about the development.
Not really, I'm afraid. So our main analysis unit has been the diet, the parent-child diet, and all of our paradigms so far have focused on the face-to-face exchange, and I don't have any, immediate ideas on how to scale up from there. I mean, perhaps going to a triadic interaction, but diet very hard. I know that some groups are working on that, but yeah, I'm not aware of any empirical work that I could refer to off the top of my head. I'm sorry, it's really past my bedtime, so if my English is deteriorating,
me too. I know how you feel.
I might just add one other sort of related question, and then there's a question in the chat as well. And that has to do with whether people are really playing the same part, like in a drumming circle, you might have a bunch of people playing the same part. If that would be different than, say in a classical ensemble where everyone's playing, or, in an orchestra, many people are playing different parts. So in that scenario, it might not just be the person next to you, but you might want a filter of the most important part at that time. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking about was, the idea of, okay, you take the other musicians that you have around you, and rather trying to synchronize to all of them, try to synchronize to some kind of inference that you make about timing given all the other sounds that you hear, right? So you hear some, maybe this goes to this kind of temporal integration window to some extent, right? But you take the motor noise and their responses and average it kind of out, and then you have some kind of filter that allows you to synchronize to. But what you mentioned brings up another point, that you have some sounds and instruments or inputs or whatever that are more useful for identifying timing. Maybe if we're all agreeing that lower frequency sounds give you better beat perception, then maybe that's what, maybe you have a low pass filter on the sound as well, or something along these lines, or maybe just depending on the style of the inputs. That also allows you a means of still just listening to many different inputs, but then at the end abstracting one thing to synchronize to. And that might be why we're so focused on these sort of dyad kind of things, so that at the end of the day, you have your idea or your sort of anticipation of a particular beat that you try to synchronize to, rather than to 100 if you're in an orchestra, which would be much more difficult.
Right.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing to that. Yeah, I mean, as those of you who've played in orchestras knows, I mean, sometimes it is discussed who one should be listening to at different points, and even writing the instrument in your part as a reminder happens. And it's not thought of as to answer that specific question, but that's maybe one kind of trace of something like what you were just saying, that you are reminding yourself, I have to listen to that player there because I have to be in time, with her or him in particular, or being in time with her or him helps everything work out well. There might be other strategies, but yeah, I think there's something to that. We do have limited capacity. Maybe a lot of things can happen automatically by the synchronous chorusing things that we've inherited, abilities that we've inherited. But to play the sort of music that we do play in concert halls, we probably need to go. We do need to go beyond that.
Okay, there's a question here. What do we know about synchronization between groups and real life social effects, and not just questionnaires addressing trust and prosociality? So can people who synchronize, can that mitigate prejudice? I guess so. The question here is, can you use group synchronization? Does that have an effect on pro-social behavior, I guess? I think Frank Russo actually has some work on that, but you guys may have comments.
I don't have a really strong comment other than that this is obviously the big important question, and there's of course a ton of anecdotal evidence, and in the last few years more evidence, and you just mentioned work by Frank and others. It's not something that I can, just pull out facts and figures at the moment, but I think it's really an important question that people are doing good work on. So I think it's worth looking at more closely.
Okay, so let me, let me ask another sort of general question. So in basically all of your talks, it came up at one time or another, either the idea of learning and experience or development, which obviously involves learning and experience in addition to probably some other mechanisms. So what changes with experience and what changes with development? And are there differences between developmental changes and just simply learning something? So Stephanie, I'm sort of going back to, I'm thinking about some of what you presented about, this coordination that happens between mothers and infants, or may not happen. And how is that learned? How does that change over development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's obviously a very interesting question for me as well. And we've just started to do some longitudinal work. So I hope I'll get to some more empirically informed answers on that soon. But one aspect that I would expect to play a role is the increasing role that I would expect the agency of the child to play. So I know some people would disagree, like Beatrice Beebe, who says that even in the very first interactions, in the first couple of weeks, the infant does play a very active role. I don't dispute that, but just relatively speaking, I guess that the adult caregiver has probably more of an agentive role early on. And so this will obviously affect lots of things in the interaction. And then one thing that I'm very interested in terms of neural maturation is actually the functional connectivity and how that develops in infancy, and whether we can see developmental changes in particular in terms of the selective entrainment of perceptual brain areas to relevant stimuli and rhythmic stimuli, because as I said, the brain is exposed. We are exposed to rhythms all the time, but some are more or less relevant. We can be more or less motivated to engage with someone, or actually some rhythms might be more predictive than others. And I think that's something that's very intriguing to me in the literature, that we do see this kind of selective effects in the adult brain. And I would be very interested to see how that comes about, and whether that has something to do with kind of the maturation of functional connectivity between perhaps more frontal brain regions and more posterior sensory brain regions. So, but yeah, it's all, I have to be honest, it's all hypotheses at the moment, because we're, I've just really started the lab and really started this longitudinal work, which is definitely required to answer these questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. Over the years, it'll be really cool if you can take some of, Peter Keller's models of brain networks that are involved, and see how, in what order they develop and what affects them, and so on. So I think that would be fascinating. So we have a question from Ian Bruce, which changes gears a little bit, but I think it's a pretty interesting and relevant question. So he says, for a decade or more, the majority of popular music recordings have been created or manipulated digitally to have perfectly fixed tempo and an exact rhythm. So would any of the presenters have an opinion on potential positive or negative impacts on rhythm perception in the general population growing up listening to this music? So in particular, we might think about kids and adolescents, I guess, who, if this is their major type of musical input, will that affect, what effects do you think that would have?
Yeah, that's interesting at very many levels, I think. I mean, it reminds me of the debate when music recordings started being made, how it changed, people's tolerance for errors in performance, but made people then play more kind of conventionally, not go out on a limb so much. Maybe that's what I've heard. And in this case, it is very interesting, and I'm not sure if this is a symptom of it, but we recently did a study where we played people different versions of synthesized quartet performances with different amounts of adaptation gain, like phase correction and noise in them. But there was a condition which we threw in just to have to have the zero gain, zero noise, non-human mechanical condition, and asked people how human-like they found things, and they found that as human-like as there was one that they that was high, but that one was as high as the highest one with a particular combination of adaptation and gain. And I don't know if that's a symptom of listening to regular quantized music or not, but it alarmed me nonetheless. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have any good answers, of course. But one of the things that it reminds me of is that there's, I think, now a development, at least I noticed a development, I haven't studied this in particular, but for certain styles of like hip hop music to have more complexity in the drum beats. And so I wonder if, like, for example, slight lags in like the downbeat that kind of leave you a little bit off kilter throughout the whole time. And I wonder if that's another symptom of this, right? That if you have a beat that is really structured and is sort of perfectly rhythmic, then it maybe allows you to actually be a bit more complex in the space that you have there. So it could be that we also, maybe we're not losing too much, but just sort of shifting a bit of like how we actually process these kind of, I wish I had an example to play for you now, but of course I don't. But yeah, so it's just sort of one thing that kind of reminded me of. I guess I think of this like of the, the kind of variability that I talked about during my talk as being a means of providing added information, right? So it's a means of sort of, or, adding anticipation or other types of attention. And so if you remove that in the digital sense, then maybe, you find other ways of putting that putting that back in. So, it's just different, not worse.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sort of goes back to the old idea of optimal amount of complexity, being pleasing and easiest to process and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so just to go back to one of the poster session, which I thought was really great. There was one poster about the sort of, is groove that we find, the sort of level of complexity that we like in groove, is that like learned, or how is it learned? Which I think showed nicely that, there's a certain amount of complexity that's sort of just baseline. That's what people like, right? And that's what, even infants, even dancers, even non-dancers, everybody likes the same amount. And what changes is like the amount that you prefer it or not, right? So it's not that you go from low complexity to high, but it's actually you go from nothing to preferring middling levels of complexity. And so I think that again speaks to this, like, okay, there's actually, it's not something that we're like learning the amount of complexity. There's just like a certain amount of information that our brains like per time sample, time unit. And we just sort of extract as much as we can from that.
Yeah, I'll just add a little comment onto that, because in general, we find with infants, we think, oh, they should just process simple stimuli the best, but it's not always the case. I mean, sometimes they actually are very similar to adults in these sorts of things. And sometimes they, show sensitivities to a large range of auditory stimuli, and then they may narrow down to a specific set later on. So, and Aaron Hannon's work showing that they can, process some complex rhythms better than some of their Western parents. So developmentally, I think there's a pretty interesting story there. Oh, I've got 2 questions from Justin London here. So I'll start with the one that came in the earliest. So he says, for everyone, we typically study rhythmic responses, behavioral or neural, to rhythmic stimuli and or tasks, but we might use non-rhythmic responses for a rhythmic task and rhythmic responses for a non-rhythmic task, and so forth. So to what extent do we need to be cognizant of these alternative frameworks for exploring timing aspects of brain and behavior? And so if that's opaque, if I'm understanding him, I think what he's saying is, okay, if you hear a really rhythmic stimulus, that might, make you feel more aroused, or something that isn't necessarily a rhythmic response, or vice versa. So Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what you're saying, is that maybe these, rhythms or lack of rhythm can affect us in ways that are non-rhythmic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem, and it's particularly for, like the kind of stuff that I talked about, how do we tell if there's a real neural oscillation in like the strongest sense of the word in the brain when you're talking about listening to music, which is itself rhythmic, right? And it's really quite difficult to tease those things apart, because also once you remove those rhythms, then it's like, well, then maybe we don't need the oscillation at this point. And so they're kind of like chicken and the egg like questions. So I think that's something that we have to think about all the time. And so I try to do that with the kind of modeling methods that allow you to sort of make different predictions about what each kind of model will generate in terms of your neural behavior, and maybe that allows you to tease these things apart. But of course, there are also infinite possible models, right? And so you can probably also build any sort of non-oscillatory model to look like an oscillation if you make it complex enough, right? So then once you get to that point, then the question is, okay, well, then does it really matter, right? So if you can build any model that can do any other thing, then we're kind of in a space. It's like, well, then maybe we just sit. I think for us, then the real goal is to build models that work. And once you have, once you have something that works, then you can look at, what are the sort of consequences of those models, and how does that actually generate these kinds of oscillations? So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, we have to be very hygienic about how we talk about, oscillation versus oscillator, and rhythms versus, rhythmic inputs and these kinds of things. And it will always be a bit messy, but we try to be as clean as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good response. It comes down to what the goal is. I mean, one factor, if I understand the broader context for the comment, one has to have a thorough enough description of the task domain for a start, and some information, attempt to collect information about the strategies that individuals use to do the task. And this, I think, has come up in some previous contexts as well, that one can probe participants, not just look at the objective measures of behavior, but actually probe them about the strategies that they're using. It gets at this issue about maybe a little bit this balance of ecological naturalness and experimental control. That's kind of the point of conducting a controlled experiment, so that you give people instructions to do the task in a certain way, and you give them certain task conditions in which to do that. So it's essentially an attempt to control these sorts of things. But if you're explaining behavior outside, and you of course, we want to know whether our experiments or the findings generalize outside, then it's a serious consideration that we have to be aware of and work towards somehow.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just speak a little bit for Stephanie, who's probably really tired right now. But I see the infant, mother-infant coordination is really important in this too, because we get this coordination, but it leads to other things like a happy infant or an attentive infant, so it leads to other behavioral consequences that are not necessarily rhythmic. And I know you've been measuring those things, and I think those relationships are really important between the rhythm and other behaviors, or even things prior to the rhythmic interaction. Yeah, so we're just about out of time. I'm just going to read. Oh, hold on. Yeah, I'm just going to read one comment from Justin London. He says, I'm going to read two comments from Justin London. Two comments on the digital rhythm question, which is a really interesting question. So first, click tracks have been used for decades, as have been drum machines. At the same time, lots of digitally produced music has a lot of timing variation, noise, glitches, etc. And many DAWs workstations have actually algorithms, right, to add various kinds of artificial expressive timing. So I think he's arguing that maybe everything isn't as regular as we might think it is. But I don't know. I would still argue back a little bit that probably with these things, it's more regular than it has been at any other point in our human history. So maybe with that, unless anyone has any final comments, I just really want to thank everyone. Peter, Keith, and Stephanie, your talks were amazing. They generated so much interest and so much discussion. So can't thank you enough. We now have a 15-minute break, and then Justin London's talk. So for those of you who are really tired in a different time zone, the talk will be available to watch another day. So please know that. But if you can stay up, after the talk, which is I think about 45 minutes, starts at 6:30 Eastern time, about 45 minutes. There will be another Q&A session afterwards, and you'll have a chance to not only ask Justin questions, but also Emily Wood, who composed the music for the dance study we've been talking about, will be there, and Amanda, one of the dancers, will be there. So it will be an interesting discussion live if you can make it. So with that, have a great 10-minute break or so, and hopefully we'll see you in a few minutes.